Hey guys, so I'm going to talk about CORS today. I'm going to break this concept into very small explanation, simple to understand explanation. I'm going to break this into some kind of an analogy which is more real world like and relatable. And not only that, I'm going to write a piece of code. I'm going to build a very small application, server application using NodeJS and Express to make it more relatable and complete. Okay, do watch this video till the end. I'm sure it is going to be beneficial for you. Let's head to the actual topic. All right, so what is CORS? It stands for cross origin resource sharing. Okay, now let me read out the actual definition of CORS, a textbook definition of CORS, so to say. CORS is a mechanism that allows resources on a web page to be requested from another domain outside their own domain. Okay, too many words. Let's just pay attention to the words that I have highlighted over here. Okay, so there's something called resource. Okay, there's something called request. Then there's something called domain. Okay, and there are two domains that are associated. Okay. So one is probably the owned domain, another is the domain that is not owned by me. Okay, as simple as that. Now you might be wondering what it is, so you will understand it only when I bring up the analogy. Okay, so let's head to the analogy. Think that there are three apartments. Okay, apartment 1, apartment 2 and apartment 3. Okay, it's some kind of a society that you live in, right? So think that there are three different apartments and imagine you live in apartment 3. Okay, apartment 3 has a gym. Okay, I would call it a resource. Okay, remember the definition from my previous slide, resource, right? So apartment 3 has a gym which I would call a resource. Now by default the apartment will allow access to same origin. What does that mean? The apartment would allow access to the residents of this apartment, right? This is the default setting. Same thing happens with respect to server. Let's say you create a server and let's say you expose a number of APIs. The default setting says by default I would allow access to same origin. That means I would allow access to people that are residents of this apartment, right? Now, let's say there is some resident of this apartment or some resident of this apartment. Let's say if they try to access the gym, which is nothing but the resource, then that is called as cross origin request. Okay. When I say client or the resident, I mean the browser. So this is the client, this is the browser, this is the server that this client is associated with. The request would come in reference to this server always. So you will represent the client based on the server. You will identify this client by the server, by the domain, I would say. Okay. There is a reason why I have mentioned Google here and I have mentioned Amazon here. You will come to know when I start coding. Okay, but for now imagine all the guys in yellow, they are the residents of this apartment. Okay, and this apartment owns this resource, so by default they can gain access no matter what. There is no special policy required to give these guys access to the resource, but here there is some kind of a special policy that is required to give them the access. As simple as that. Now let's head to the code. Okay, I'm going to write a small code which will represent this server, and I'm also going to simulate this type of a behavior. Okay, let me head to the code. Okay, before that I think I need to create a folder. So let me go to folder. Right, so let me create a folder called CORS. I'll say CORS and it's a brand new folder. Let me copy the path. Let me head to Visual Studio Code and let me open this folder. It's a blank folder that I have created. I'll say Control J to bring up the terminal, and then I'm going to initialize the NodeJS project. What is the command to initialize NodeJS project? npm init -y. It's just going to create a package.json for me, nothing very complex, and I am going to rename this to server.js just for the sake of consistency. I'm also going to create the JS file, that is server.js. Okay. First things first, I need to install Express on my project because I am going to use Express framework on top of Node.js here to expose an API. Okay. So what I'll do is I'll say npm install Express. Okay, it has installed Express for me, and now what I'm going to do is I'm going to import Express. So I'll say Express equals require Express, as simple as that. And now I'm going to spin up an application that is going to run on Express framework. So I'll say const app Express, right? And now I need a port number. Okay, before I launch the application, I need a port number. So I'll say const port equals 3000, right? And then I'm going to listen to this port. So I'll say app.listen to port, and there's going to be a callback that I will receive. This will be like once the listening is successful, then I will say console.log, yeah, CLG is the short form. I'll say server listening to port. Okay, as simple as that. Now let's run this server now. I'll say node server.js. Okay, it says server listening to port. This means I managed to spin up a server here. I've built a very small application which represents a server. Okay, now let me quit this application and let me add another thing. Okay, so what is that thing? I'm going to say app.get, and I'm going to simulate the analogy. So I'm going to say API/gym. Okay, and I'm going to say request response, and this is going to return me something. I need to implement this, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to return a status of 200, which is nothing but successful or okay. And what am I going to return? I'm going to return a JSON. Okay, so JSON will be something like message access granted. Okay, it's a very simple code. So I have created a get API on my server, which actually will return me a callback wherein it will return me request and response. I'm not doing anything on the request. I'm just trying to set the status to 200, which is nothing but OK, which represents OK status. And I'm going to pass JSON. I'm going to pass JSON as my response, right? And with the message access granted, right? Now let's see if we can test this. So before that, I need to start my server. Server listening to port 3000. Let me head to the browser. I will open an incognito mode so that it is always beneficial. So I'll say HTTP localhost 3000/API/Gym. Okay, before I do that, let me open the network tab, and I'm already filtering based on Gym. When I hit this, you see access granted. It returned me the response that I have configured over here, right? Access granted. And when you see the network tab, there is one call, okay? Only one call that is made. And what is that call? It's a get call. It returned a status code 200 OK, which I set it on my server, and it returned me the response that I wanted. As simple as that, right? So there is no extraordinary thing, I would say. This is all very simple, right? Now this represents a scenario wherein the resident of this apartment that you have Gym is coming to access your resource. Okay, if I go back here, you see this resident or this resident or this resident of this apartment is trying to access the Gym. So there's nothing extraordinary. It is already allowed. Okay, it's already allowed, right? So now if I go back to my browser, let me open google.com. Okay, and let me open the inspect element. Okay, why is it taking so much time? I don't know why. So okay, took a while, don't know why. Now I want to simulate the request, cross origin request from google.com. Okay, so I'll say fetch, I'll say HTTP localhost 3000 API Gym. Okay, so Google is trying to access this API, so I'm trying to simulate that behavior, and I'd say then it's going to be an async. Okay, async, and it is going to return me a response. Okay, and what am I going to do with this response? I'll just print it. So I'll say console.log, I will say await response.json. So because I'm returning the response in JSON format, that's why I'm trying to convert it into JSON. Okay, now let me hit this and let me see what is going to happen. It says access to fetch localhost Gym from google.com has been blocked by CORS policy. No access control allow origin header is present on the requested resource, right? Now this is what I'm trying to simulate here. If I go back to my analogy here, you'll see I'm trying to simulate this request. This request is not allowed because my default setting does not allow requests from a different from a resident of a different apartment. Okay, in this case it's Google, so now you understand why I named it Google, right? So Google is trying to access my local host, and by default I will not allow it. Okay, now how would I allow this? So let's see if there is a way to allow the request. So let's head back to the browser and let's see if I get hold of the header that it's expecting me to configure. So what I'll do is I'll say response.setHeader, and I'll add this header, whatever I copied from there, and I will say allow this header to whom? To google.com. So I just need to provide the domain here, okay, nothing else. So I'll say allow this header, allow the requests from whom? From google.com. So adding a header would be similar to allowing access of the resource from a different origin. Okay. Now let me close the server, let me restart the server, let me head back to the browser and let's see if it returns a response now. Here you go, it returned a response, right? Now if I go back to the network tab, you would realize I see 4 calls. So I made 2 calls, right? So this was my first call, this was my second call. So ideally there should have been only 2 requests I should see here on the network tab. But you might be wondering, what are these 2 additional requests that it sent? Now if you closely observe, there's something called pre-flight. Okay, it says pre-flight, and if I go to the header part, it says request method is options. What is that all about? Right. Now if I go back to my earlier one, you would only see one request, which is nothing but the get request, right? But here there are 2 requests. So if I make one request, the browser actually makes one more request of method options, right? Even here it made a request options. What is that all about? You might be wondering, right? Now you also see that the options is returning something here, right? Now what is that the options is written? Okay, let's go back to this and let's see what the response header at the actual response, the get response has written. Now here I'm seeing access control allow origin google.com, which I added over here in my code, right? This is the reason why it started working for me, right? I granted access on this request, but you might be still wondering, what is this options call all about? Okay, now just wait for a while. I'll implement something here before I actually explain you what the options means. Okay, now let me go back to the console, and while the access is now granted, you might be thinking, okay, the access has been granted, right? Now let's add some complexity now to my request. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pass an additional header. Okay, so I'm going to form an object, I'm going to call it headers, and I'm going to say headers will have something called content type, and this content type is going to be nothing but application /JSON. Okay, now I have added something extraordinary to my headers. Okay, I am not going with the default set of headers, so I'm trying to actually, I'm interested in something more than what I intended to. Okay, now let's see what it returns. See, it actually blocked the request now. So earlier it was granting the request, right? Earlier the request was passing, but now the request is failing just because you have added an additional header, right? So there are some headers like these which the browser would understand, and the server would understand, and it will not allow access to the resource unless and until these additional headers are also whitelisted. So far what you did was you just whitelisted the domain, right? But now what it says is, let's read this now. So the message is pretty much the same. What you see here, the message is pretty much the same. The only difference is it now says pre-flight request does not pass as access control check. Okay, so here there was no mention of pre-flight request, right? There's a mention of pre-flight request. And what is that pre-flight request that it is trying to mention? It's nothing but the options call. Okay, so looks like it is expecting something to be provided by the options call. Okay, so what I'm going to do is let me go here, and now let me go to my code. I'm going to implement something which is going to satisfy the pre-flight request. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to implement the options API, options method. Okay, I'm going to say star because this options is going to be applicable for all the resources, not just the gym. Okay, and then what I'm going to do is it is going to accept request and response, and then I'm going to implement this callback. What I'm going to do here, I'm going to set the header what it expects. So it's going to be the same header. In fact, it's going to be the same. Okay. Now, instead of doing this, let me create a reusable function. So I always believe in breaking down into reusable functions. So enforce policy, okay, which is going to accept request and response, and then it's going to do something here. So what is it going to do here? It's going to just enforce the policy. So all I will do is I'll call enforce policy from here with request and response. Okay, and I'm going to call the same from here. Right? So far so good. So let me restart my server. So I have added the access control allow origin even on options call. Okay, so that I want to get rid of this error. Okay, now I'm restarting the server, and I'll head back to the browser and I'll fire the same call. Okay, wait a minute. So I think I missed something. I think I should end the request here. So I'll say end the response. So I'll say response dot status. I'll pass as 200, and I'll say end. Okay. Once I enforce the policy, I should ideally end the response. Okay, end the call. Okay. Now I'm going to restart the server. Right. So let me fire this API call now. And now you see I'm getting a different error. I'm still getting an error, by the way. I probably would have got rid of this error. But now if you see here, I'm getting a different error. It says access to localhost gym from google.com has been blocked by CORS policy. Request header field content type is not allowed by this header. So it says specifically about content type. Now I'm passing something, and looks like it explicitly wants me to set these headers. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to set this also to my enforce policy. So I've already copied that header key, and I'm going to say content type. Okay, so I'm whitelisting the exact header that it is trying to request. Okay, now let me restart my server and let me fire this API call one more time, and here you go. It says access is granted. Now if I go to network tab, you'll see so many options call, right? So options call is actually going to happen because every time there is a different origin, there is a different domain that requests for access to a resource, then there will be something called options call, which is nothing but the pre-flight call that will be made. And you have to ensure that you are enforcing the policy on the options as well. Okay, this is in addition to the actual resource. Okay, now let's head back to the analogy that I was explaining you, and let's see how we can relate it with the options call, right? So initially what was happening, there was no access to this resource, right? So what we did was we added something called access control allow origin, and we added the Google domain here. And then when the client made a request, cross origin request to access gym, the client was able to, the user was able to, and this is like when I say client, Imagine it's the console window that I was using. Okay. Now, when the request is made, the cross origin request is made, it's successful. The access, this guy is able to gain access to this resource, right? But then when I tried to bring in some additional things, the request was immediately blocked by the options call. Now, what could be the options call here? Where would options fit in this analogy, right? Now, when I say where would option fit in, it would be something like this. Option loosely relates to a security guard standing in the gate of your apartment. Okay. And why would this security guard come into picture? Probably the guy who wants to use the gym is bringing his own equipment, gymming equipment, right, which might not be allowed. So there's something additional this client is trying to do. The resident of this different apartment is trying to do, right? So that is why even that has to be allowed as per the policy, so that the security guard has access to this policy, all the policies that the server has framed. And this also means that even the gym needs to maintain all the policies. Okay, just because the security guard has allowed you to gain access to this resource does not mean that gym will not have the policy. The gym will equally have all the policies set on them. Okay, and they have the right to deny anything, even if the security guard has allowed you. Remember, the gym or the server that owns the gym would still have the right to deny access of this user based on the policy, right? So this is again loosely analogous to the CORS phenomena or the CORS terminology that I was trying to relate to. Okay, I hope you are able to understand what CORS is from the analogy that I provided you, and I would request you to implement something very similar. Start using Amazon.in. Okay, instead of Google, Amazon.com or Amazon.in, whatever you feel like. See if you can get into Amazon.com site, and you open a console window and see if you can make a request to the server and see the same errors that I got and how you would resolve those errors, right? All right, so this is the end of my video. I hope you like it. I hope you are able to understand the concept of CORS. I hope to bring in more videos like this where I would talk about analogies. I'll talk about real world analogies. Some analogies might be loosely related. Some analogies might be strongly related. Okay, but this is probably the best way to understand a software concept. Okay, until my next video, take care. Bye.